Hi. Thank you all for coming. My name is Bob Kopp. I'm a professor in the School of Arts and Sciences, director of the Rutgers Institute of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, and co-chair of the President's Task Force on Carbon Neutrality and Climate Resilience. And I want to thank you all for coming out to this, which is our first of 4 town halls we'll be holding in February in support of the task force's work. I'm going to turn it over to the provost of Rutgers, New Brunswick, Prabhas Moghe, to give some introductory remarks, and then I will walk you through where we are and what we hope to do from here.
So I think that applause was for him, right? Okay, so I had a contest running in my head, which I didn't tell I was hoping that at least one person would win. The question was, who is the steward of this initiative here? And I was thinking in my head, anyone that will be sitting on that row, the front row. So any students? Any students want to vie for that? There's a whole row open here in the front. No? So you don't have the spunk, the leadership spunk? Remember, tomorrow at the Targum, there will be a picture of the people that are here. And that row is not a good sign. There you go. There you go. So, I'm glad we're finding humor and levity in what is an existential crisis, which brings all of you here. Don't have to preach to the choir, but I am one of the people at the university that is deeply committed to figuring out how does Rutgers step up its game. We already are a strong research powerhouse in climate science. I'm acutely aware of that, and I'd like to grow that footprint even more. But we are uniquely equipped in the state of New Jersey to define what a public research comprehensive university could be doing on behalf of a state, on behalf of an extremely vibrant coastline, a highly populated state, a highly diverse state, industrialized state, a state with a global outlook. How do we prepare ourselves for a climate action plan? And how do we, in turn, get this plan to resonate beyond our own borders in the state of New Jersey? Now, you all might be aware, I'm wondering how many of the students here are aware that the governor of New Jersey has an energy master plan, right? So there's a website where this plan is now been put forth. There's lots of advocates of it. And I think it's really important for Rutgers to be stepping up its game, like I said before. So, about a year and a half ago, Bob Kopp came to us and complained that Rutgers wasn't getting its act together. And I, of course, was complaining to yet other people that we need to get our act together. But as you can imagine, Rutgers is an enormous place. It's not just Rutgers, New Brunswick. There are other entities here. And so we're extremely fortunate that President Barchi put his weight behind this initiative, which is why we're having this town hall here. So, I think you'll roll up your sleeves and get to work as soon as Bob has shared his vision for what this exercise is about. And I must stress that this initiative is not for the faint-hearted. This is a significant amount of trying to reconfigure and pivot what we do ordinarily. We're an extremely old university, which usually is bragging points for a university. We're 253 years old, one of the oldest universities, but from a climate action standpoint, that's a huge problem because we have hundreds of buildings that are really old and energy inefficient. So how do you straddle this divide that we have of being old and inefficient in terms of our infrastructure with being forward-looking? You may have seen the big idea symposium we had a few months ago. Hello, Jeannie, how are you? And some of those best ideas that were put forth were on technologies and policies in terms of creating a carbon neutral planet. So I love the title for Bob's presentation. I would just suggest a minor change. There's one word in there which starts with the letter N, which we could swap with another word which would also start with the letter N. There you go. And I'll pass it on to Bob on that optimistic note. Thank you all.
Thank you, Prabhas, for those great remarks. So thank you all again for showing up here today. This is a momentous and really important effort we're undertaking as a university. I know you're all here because you know what I'm going to say on the next couple of slides, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Right? Climate change is no longer an issue for the distant future. Right? It's already affecting people throughout the world, throughout the nation, including here in New Jersey. If we look at temperature records, New Jersey today is about 4 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was in the late 19th century. If we look at rainfall and snowfall records, the amount of precipitation falling in the wettest 1% days in the Northeast US has increased by about 55% since the 1950s, leading to more intense flooding. If we look at sea level rise, roughly 70% of tidal floods along the Jersey Shore today are caused by sea level rise associated with global warming. And these problems are going to keep getting worse until we stabilize the global climate. And 100+ years of climate science, carbon cycle science, tell us that to do that, we need to dramatically change the way our energy system and our economic activities are structured so that we're no longer releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We need to bring net human-caused carbon dioxide emissions to zero and sharply reduce emissions of other greenhouse gases. That's the only way to stop the temperature of the planet from continuing to increase. This is a global challenge. This map here shows you per capita carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel and cement around the world. And you can see that this is a competition the US is still in the lead for. We are still one of the top per capita emitters of carbon dioxide. Well ahead of Europe, well ahead of China, well ahead of India, well ahead of almost everywhere except the Gulf oil states. But this map is showing you where total carbon dioxide emissions are coming from. And we are no longer #1 in the world and have not been for most of the last decade the #1 emitter of CO2. That's been China. The US is responsible for about 15% of global carbon dioxide emissions. So this is a global challenge. It requires all countries throughout the world to play their part, and it requires those of us at Rutgers to play our part. We can't get to net zero emissions if Rutgers is not net zero. And the faster we get our greenhouse gas emissions to net zero, the less climate change we have to deal with. The best estimates are that current policies sort of set us on a course for about 3 degrees Celsius of global warming above the late 19th century with an uncertainty range of about 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. The international goals set forth in the Paris Agreement are well below 2 degrees Celsius, with ideally as close as possible to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And to do that, we need to get off a course of flat to rising greenhouse gas emissions and rapidly get on a course to declining global greenhouse gas emissions. This analysis from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research suggests that to get on a world consistent with 2 degrees C, we need to reduce our global emissions by about 20% by 2030. To get on a world consistent with a 1.5 degree target, we need to reduce our global emissions by about half by 2030. And even in a world with a stabilized climate, right, we're already seeing impacts. We're still going to have to deal with those impacts. We're still going to have to manage the risks we don't avoid. And Rutgers, in fact, has been a leader, as Prabhas mentioned, in helping deal with some of those impacts. This photo here is some work that Brooke Maslow at the Agricultural Experiment Station has been doing with the town of Woodbridge to help them develop their resilience plan in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. As Prabhas mentioned, Rutgers is already a leader in climate change research and engagement. Through entities like the Rutgers Institute of Earth, Oceans, and Atmospheric Sciences, the Rutgers Climate Institute, and the Rutgers Energy Institute, we have over 200 faculty working to understand our planet and how to live on it in a more sustainable and resilient manner. We are consistently among the top 4 Big Ten schools in the amount of research activity in earth, oceans, and atmospheric sciences, which is a rough proxy for the amount of work in climate-related areas. Our faculty are active in international efforts like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and the National Climate Assessment. And we have pioneering efforts in community-engaged climate research and resilience through initiatives like the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance, Jack Cousteau Natural and Estuarine Research Reserves at Getting to Resilience Initiative, and the Coastal Climate Risk and Resilience Graduate Program. Through the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, we're working to promote climate-smart agriculture, and we are the new home of the newly set up New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center. We've also already taken actions to reduce our emissions, even in the absence of a strategic plan for doing so. We have about 10 megawatts of on-campus solar capacity. New buildings on campus are built to either LEED Silver or Gold standards. Our 2015 master plans highlight sustainability as a key objective. We're actively working with the NJ Department of Transportation in Middlesex County on bike paths and bike lanes. For the last almost 2 decades, we've had discounted New Jersey Transit monthly passes. We're working on energy efficiency improvements to fleet vehicles into the cogeneration plants on Bush and Newark. And we have tree replantings and wetlands established to assist in stormwater management. But we also face distinctive challenges as well as opportunities. We are very large. We have nearly 100,000 students, faculty, and staff. So would be the size of New Jersey's 7th largest city, except that we're spread out over 10 square miles scattered over the state. We have nearly 1,000 facilities that we're owned, constituting about 29 million square feet of floor space, almost half of which are more than half a century old. And we also have almost 400 leased facilities. We have more than 300 miles of underground water and sewer lines, one of the largest dining services systems in the country, one of the largest residence hall systems in the country, one of the largest campus transportation systems in the country. And in our $4.4 billion operational budget, we spend about $240 million on supplies, which could be leveraged in a more carbon negative direction, and $120 million on plant operations and maintenance. On top of that, we have about a $5 billion deferred maintenance liability. So we need to be making investments in our physical plant. If we look across the Big Ten, we are a little behind, admittedly, in developing a strategic plan for dealing with climate action. There are 8 of the 14 Big Ten schools have climate action plans developed at some point, mostly over the last decade. 6 of them have identified 2050 as a target for being carbon neutral. University of Michigan has an ongoing process to identify a carbon neutral timeframe that's about a year ahead of us. Penn State is starting one up now. And many of these schools that have climate action plans, although not all of them, have seen quite significant reductions in their emissions over the last decade, some in the range of about 30%. So in September, President Barchi set up the President's Task Force on Carbon Neutrality and Climate Resilience to develop a Rutgers strategy for carbon neutrality and climate resilience, meaning how do we get to net zero carbon dioxide emissions and sharply reduce our other greenhouse gas emissions, and how do we enhance the capacity of the university and the state to manage the risks of a changing climate. So, pardon the wordy slide, here's what we've set out as our scope of work. So we're looking at both climate change mitigation, that's the neutrality part, and climate change adaptation, that's the resilience part. We're focused to a significant extent on campus operations, but we're also looking at how those can feed onto and relate to teaching, research, campus culture, and as Prabhas mentioned, how we foster climate positive economic development throughout the state. We need to come up with compelling and impactful approaches Rutgers could adopt, and along with real analyses that are actionable about what the benefits of those are going to be in terms of emissions reductions and resiliency improvements, what their financial costs or savings are going to be, and what other benefits we get from their strategies. We need to have actionable implementation pathways that include timescales and ways of measuring progress. We need to look at how we get our gigantic university to work together, overcoming institutional and organizational challenges to implement the approaches we identify. And we need to have strategies for broad engagement of the university community and, as appropriate, other stakeholders. Again, I don't want to keep making the same point, but this is really important. I think the place we have the most opportunity to innovate is by looking at how we can actually leverage a 100,000 person university in a way that is qualitatively different than you can get from 25, 4,000 person colleges to advance climate positive economic development. And in the course of doing that, I'm sure we're going to identify many key unknowns and gaps that will require additional analysis beyond our current time frame. So to get us all on the same planes, when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we divide those up into different scopes. So scope 1 refers to those emissions that are happening directly on campus. Primarily, that would be through the burning of fossil fuels. A very, very small portion of that also is associated with things like our livestock agriculture. So that's things like heat production for buildings, things like electricity produced by burning fossil fuels in our cogeneration plants, and things like transportation on campus. Scope 2 are the indirect emissions associated with purchasing electricity off the grid. And then scope 3 are indirect emissions associated with other sorts of purchases or induced behaviors. So that's things like the emissions associated with the food we eat and the food we throw away, associated with the supplies we purchase and the supplies we throw away, and associated with commuting and with business travel. And then the other thing I want to make is I'm sort of what we call scope 4, right? So what the indirectly induced effect. Again, the way Rutgers as an economic entity affects the rest of the economy of the state and can lead to emissions reductions or decreases through those activities. So in the pre-planning report that came out in January, we did a preliminary analysis for fiscal year 2019 of Rutgers, New Brunswick's greenhouse gas emissions. So we looked at scope 1 and scope 2 and did some approximations to look at the indirect emissions associated with transportation and travel. We did not have the supply chain emissions. But here's a picture. So roughly, Rutgers, New Brunswick is directly responsible, scope 1 and 2, for 210,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. That's roughly 1/500th of all the emissions in New Jersey. Of that, scope 1 and scope 2 plus travel emissions, almost half are due to energy used to heat our buildings or supply hot water. 23% is indirectly scope 2 due to emissions associated with the grid electricity we purchase. About 13% is associated with electricity produced in our cogeneration plants. And then roughly scope 3, commuting emissions, and this is a very rough calculation, but it's roughly comparable in scale to our on-campus electricity production. Buses, while very visible, are a very small portion of our emissions, only about 2%. Probably air travel associated with our business expenses is a comparable scale. So here's our timeline. So we've gone through the pre-planning process. We're now in February 2020. We're starting the town halls, and thank you all again for being here at the very first one. We're also starting to set up working groups to look at the variety of factors that contribute to our emissions and our resilience. We have to have an interim report that will be presented to President Barchi at the beginning of May for him to hand off to President Holloway during the transition. We'll continue after working on that report, assuming we get the blessing from the president to do so, on deep dives into those different factors that are driving our emissions and affecting our vulnerability. The aim being to finish those deep dives by about September so that in October, November, December, we can integrate them to look at what are our different pathable options, what are our integrated scenarios for achieving carbon neutrality and improved resilience on different timeframes. That will lead to the public release of a report sometime around January or February, and we hope to get more feedback and multiple checkpoints in the process, including before and after that report, leading to a report that will be presented to President Holloway and the Board of Governors and Board of Trustees in June 2021. Now, I want to emphasize this is a very ambitious timeframe. When we've looked at other schools of comparable scale that have embarked upon this is usually at least a 2-year process. We've doing it as an 18-month process, but I'm confident that the team we're putting together and the community, the people who will show up here will help us get this done in an efficient time.